Last year, a group of Canadian media companies launched a lawsuit against OpenAI. Here's a bit of the joint statement they released at the time. OpenAI regularly breaches copyright and online terms of use by scraping large swaths of content from Canadian media to help develop its products such as ChatGPT. OpenAI is capitalizing and profiting from the use of this content without getting permission or compensating content owners. Now, an Ontario court has decided the case can proceed here. I asked Kevin Siu, an intellectual property lawyer with Gilbert LLP, how this case is shaping up and how worried OpenAI should be about the multiple cases that have been filed against it. Kevin, welcome to the Rundown. How are you doing?
Good, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Now, before we get started, I want to mention that, and to our viewers, that TVO is not participating in this lawsuit that we are talking about, and you, Kevin, are not involved in the case, correct?
That's correct. I am a lawyer, but I don't represent any of the parties in the lawsuit.
All right, well, let's talk about the case. The plaintiffs in the copyright case against OpenAI in Ontario include the Canadian Press, Torstar, the Globe and Mail, Postmedia, and CBC. What are their main complaints?
So this is a conglomeration of, I think, most of Canada's biggest news publishers, and their complaints are pretty broad, but largely they focus on OpenAI's use of various news articles that they've scraped from online. So as you know, you can access CBC or the Toronto Star and get some news articles. Some of them are paywalled, and you can access those articles, and their complaint is that OpenAI has copied, downloaded, scraped some of these articles and used it to train their ChatGPT model in order to produce the product, ChatGPT.
All right. OpenAI uses what's known as Retrieval-Augmented generation, and it's quite central to this case. For people who don't know, including myself, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so Retrieval-Augmented Generation, or RAG, is the acronym that's often used, RAG. That refers to one part of the sort of output process for these large language models. So if you've ever used ChatGPT and you enter some input and the ChatGPT bot says something, it goes through a couple of processes. One process is sort of taking your input, determining what it should do, and then there's a process at the end called RAG, which is used to prevent or limit hallucinations. What it does is when the output is about to be coming out from the LLM, the large language model, the RAG system usually is designed to access a fact storage or access the internet and fact check its own output before giving you an answer so that it can limit the amount of hallucination that the chatbot gives you.
Now, we hear a lot about hallucinations with AI technology. Is that something that happens commonly when we're talking about news articles and things that you could quickly search up if you went to one of their websites?
I mean, this depends on the prompt. I think most AI models try to use some version of retrieval-augmented generation to sort of limit all of that, so they can fact check the articles if someone asks it, on what date did something happen, and the ChatGPT model will probably look up that information before giving it to you. But it doesn't really prevent all hallucination. I think most models today still suffer some degree of that to greater or lesser extent, depending on what you're asking it.
So here in Canada, we have fair dealing, which for people who don't know is a law that allows us to use copyrighted material without permission for certain purposes, one of them including news reporting as well. Could OpenAI have its copyrighted material use that instead?
Yeah, so fair dealing is a very nuanced subject. It's often used as a defense, but it's also been called a user's right in Canada. So if you or I were just researching news for our own educational purposes, then we would be able to, buy a newspaper or access it online, and we can read it and perhaps, reproduce a bit of it, send it back and forth for mark it up for research. And those are sort of allowable fair dealing purposes. They're sort of a scope of permitted activities that users in Canada are allowed to do with copyrighted works like books and news articles. And this is a central doctrine in Canadian copyright law, but it has certain limits to it. There are specified purposes like education and research where you're definitely allowed to use the fair deal work in a manner that is in accordance with fair dealing, subject to some limitations, but it often depends on what you're doing and how much you're using that work for.
Help us understand what's at stake. A lot of people might be looking at this and be like, oh, well, these are some Canadian news organizations who are probably seeing, their advertising shares plummeting and not making enough money. So this is maybe them kind of looking at that opportunity. But help us understand really what's at stake here with the plaintiff and OpenAI.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are two aspects to it, at least two aspects. There are many more than that, but one is, as you've identified, it's monetary, it's commercial, which goes back to your last question about fair dealing. One of the factors as to whether some use is fair or not under Canadian law includes how commercial that is. So is someone like OpenAI or any other company making a lot of money off of, Toronto Star or CBC's news articles? And they do charge a fee for using some of their pro or plus versions of their products. So they are making some amount of money. And so at stake in part is who can profit off of those works. Obviously for news organizations, the core of their business is, selling newspapers, selling subscriptions to their website, and licensing their content to various outlets. And, as far as we know, and as complained in the lawsuit, OpenAI hasn't paid any licensing fees for the use of those works. So a large aspect of this is, should OpenAI pay for the use of those works, and how much should they pay for the use of those works? Because, some aspect of it is if you're, again, let's take an example. If it's just me and you going to buy a newspaper, we're paying a pretty low amount of money and we're not really profiting off of it. But a large company like OpenAI, which is, has millions of users, how much should they pay for the use of articles? And they use many millions of articles. So that's, a key aspect of the case.
What happens, let's say this court case goes through and the business model of OpenAI changes, where they do have to pay for something. How does that impact their bottom line and their business model?
Well, I'm not in charge of OpenAI, thank goodness. But I think it's pretty fundamental to how they operate. And I think if you sort of take apart and look at it at a more high-level view, for most of these companies who develop large language models, right, a part of the technological innovation that they claim to have brought to the forefront these days is that they've used or they've ingested into their AI models a large portion, if not all, of the internet. They claim, that's the large in large language model, and if they have to pay for a significant or all of the content that they're consuming, then it really could impact their bottom line, because they're certainly using a lot of data. They're continually scraping information, and depending on how much they have to pay to access or use that content, it could really impact whether or not those models become financially viable.
We have about 30 seconds left, but I do have one more question for you. The case we're talking about right now is Canadian media companies suing OpenAI in Ontario. But in New York, there is a similar case happening right now where New York Times is suing Microsoft and OpenAI for copyright infringement. Is there something that we can learn from this case? Do the folks who are following this case here in Ontario need to keep a close eye on what's happening with that?
Yeah, I mean, from an economic perspective, yes, because OpenAI's business model is going to be influenced by lawsuits all around the world, not just in Canada. But to another extent, not really, because Canadian laws are very different than American laws, and there are copyright defenses and doctrines that are different between the two countries.
All right, well, Kevin, we are going to leave it there. Really appreciate the insights, and of course, something that we will continue to follow. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.